Hello everyone, today we are going to present our paper, Autocomplete Animated Sculpting. Sculpting content can be divided into two categories, static sculpting models and dynamic sculpting animation. However, it requires high artistic expertise and manual labor. The outputs of static sculpting are organic 3D models with freestyle deformations. And usually, in order to create a model, it requires hundreds or thousands of brushing strokes. The outputs of animated sculpting are organic model animations. As we can see, it contains more organic motions and is common to see topological changes, such as tree and frog growing. Compared to static sculpting, it becomes even more tedious to author animated sculpting sequences. This project will aim to address this challenge. What is the workflow of animated sculpting? Keyframe-based animation is the typical method to create animated sculpting. Yet, it can require high amounts of technical expertise and steep learning curve for novice users. Users often need to work on multiple different tools for modeling, animation, and sculpting animation refinements. Now, we summarize its pros and cons of existing pipeline. On one side, sculpting is a very popular content creation task. The most significant advantage is the high creation freedom with the individual user styles. Manually authoring keyframe sculpting provides users lots of freedom. But, on the other hand, the process to learn and master keyframe sculpting is not easy. The most tools and interfaces are designed for experienced users. It can be time-consuming if we want to create very complex sculpting content. In sum, existing animated sculpting creation pipeline contains following features. It contains multiple stages with different tools, such as ZBrush for modeling, Maya for animation, and Mesh 3D for sculpting animation refinement. The modeling and animation stages are usually independent. Different animation tools provide different manipulators, such as rigging, cages, and gestures. The pipeline is suitable for commercial animation production with expert team collaborations, but will be very difficult for novice users for learning and tutorials. Finally, existing pipeline becomes tedious to handle topological changes, which is very common for organic sculpting animations. Our motivation comes from the keyword workflow. The process how the painting, animation, and models are authored by users is called workflow. They are related words leveraging workflows for different content creations, including 2D painting and 2D hand-drawn animation, 3D viewpoint suggestions, 3D summarizations for visualizations, and 3D static sculpting. Also in VR for painting tutorials. These recent works have shown the potential of workflow, which motivates to leverage the workflow to assist animated sculpting content creation. Following the workflow motivation, we have the following ideas for our autocomplete animated sculpting. We aim at an intuitive and friendly user interface for novice users. Thus, instead of having multiple independent tools, we aim at a unified system. And instead of proposing new animation manipulators or relying on external animation cache, we want to maintain and leverage the inherent brushing operations. And finally, we want to leverage the keyframe sculpting workflow to design methods to assist interactive sculpting animations. Here comes our system. At first, I will show the main interface features. Later, I will discuss the underlying methods. One first thing about keyframe-based animation is the initial shape. Drawing each frame from scratch can be tedious and requires precise alignment via onion skin. Thus, our system suggests the initial shapes for each frame. After the first few frames, our system can suggest the initial shape when the user adds a new frame, rendered in transparent yellow, to bootstrap keyframes. Now we have helped users start each frame. However, Adding details to each frame is still challenging. As the user plays surface stroke to add details, our system predicts what might be done next across frames. The suggestions are continuously updated in real time and visualized in yellow color. Users can accept, partially accept, or ignore the suggestions. Besides surface strokes, we also support large-scale freeform deformations across frames. Keyframe sculpting involves both coarse and fine-scale editing, often in an interactive fashion. Users usually perform similar brush editing across frames. It will be very tedious to repeat details across frames. When they start to edit one region within a single frame, our system can propagate edits across multiple spatial regions and temporal frames. Clone is a common tool among different interactive content authoring systems to help reduce contents. Users can clone source regions via red strokes to different target regions across frames via green strokes. The clone suggestions can adapt to different shades across frames along with the targets. Manually altered keyframes are often too sparse for smooth motion and require the addition of in-betweens. To help produce smoother animations, our system can also generate workflow-driven interpolations as in-betweens, rendered in light purple for visualization. The output is a frog-growing animation with topological changes, freeform deformations, and surface detail changes. Here we discuss our method on keyframe sculpting workflow analysis and synthesis. At the very beginning, we need to observe the general keyframe sculpting carefully to distill the common practice. As we see in the introduction video, keyframe sculpting process involves multiple types of operations, including various sculpting brushes such as drag and grab, manipulation operations such as translation, rotation, and scaling. And different from static sculpting, another key difference is that we need to control the keyframes for cross-frames editing and manipulations. Then, accordingly, we record these keyframe sculpting workflows for our analysis and synthesis. At first, we look at a concrete prediction example to get a high-level idea. This is a tree-growing sculpting animation, a typical keyframe sculpting animation example with organic topological changes. If we create the keyframes frame by frame all manually, it will be very tedious. For example, after we have created the first frame, we start to alter the second frame. Instead of manually altering, can we analyze the workflows to synthesize remaining strokes? To do so, we deform strokes in the previous frame to match the current user strokes to make predictions. After a few more strokes, we update the sample matching via global neighborhood similarity measurement. With updated correspondence, we deform previous frame to predict remaining strokes for current frame. So for these tree sculpting animations, instead of finishing all frames manually, we provide suggestions across frames for automation and visualize as transparent yellow hints. Now we look at more details for the predictions. We adopt a sample-based representations. Brush strokes are often coherent across neighboring frames. We call the previous frame as the source frame and current editing frame as the target frame. With strokes in target frames as implicit control handles, we deform strokes in source frame to predict what else might be performed for target frame. Now we see more deformation details. The strokes are augmented with a graph-based deformation model. With user input strokes in target frame as implicit deformation handles, we deform the source graph towards target frame. However, sculpting strokes contain semantics. Only valid strokes can bring valid mesh deformations. With only deformation constraints, it's unlikely to get valid predictions here. Then, we need to include extra constraints to make the deformation sculpting aware. That is, for sculpting strokes, surface strokes should adhere to mesh surface, while freeform strokes need to start from the surface. With both deformation and sculpting constraints, we deform source towards the target frame for transparent yellow suggestions. The prediction quality is related to the accuracy of correspondence between source and target objects. We adopt a stroke and sample-based Gaussian representation. We then propose a global similarity measurement to dynamically determine and update correspondence between source and target. Specifically, we measure the similarity based on their neighbors as in the neighborhood-based texture synthesis optimizations. We define the local sample neighborhood to contain samples of the same brush type and fall within its spatial neighborhood. In order to better capture broader context among strokes, at first, we define the predecessor samples as those sculpted at or before the sample along the parent stroke. Then, we design a global neighborhood as the accumulations of the local neighborhoods of the predecessor samples. Then, we measure the similarity of samples across frames via their global neighborhoods. With the updated correspondence for the deformations and optimizations, we get the UI suggestions. Here are two complete sessions to also different organic sculpting animations. With input keyframe workflows, we provide suggestions for future edits across frames and visualize them in transparent yellow colors. For the suggestions, users can fully or partially accept via the gesture, or ignore them by continuing their UI brushing to maintain full control. Finally, we get a keyframe sculpting animation with organic motions. We conducted a user study to gain insights on how our system compares with the traditional fully manual keyframe sculpting pipeline. A target session is designed to measure and compare the objective performance and subjective experience of our system compared to the existing pipeline. The participants were asked to reproduce a typical target sculpting animation sequence in two separate conditions. On average, the target session took 28 minutes for the traditional pipeline and 12 minutes for our unified system, indicating that our autocomplete system can help users reduce time and efforts. Users found our system easier and faster with the autocomplete suggestions, and they felt more satisfied with our system compared to the traditional pipeline for this typical example. Here we discuss the future risks. Now we provide a basic keyframe management. It will make the animated sculpting more powerful if we can include more advanced keyframe managements. To do that, we can learn from Quill and Maya to design intuitive and powerful keyframes. Second, for now we focus on sculpting models and motions creations. A potential work will be adding texture editing and autocompletes, which will make the sculpting content much more appealing. Finally, recent years, VR has shown great potential. One of the most popular and successful one is VR sculpting. VR sculpting is based on voxel, so it becomes much easier to perform CS3 operations for certain large-scale deformation and motions. So VR sculpting and animation can be a very promising direction. Thank you.